Good morning, everybody. I'm looking at giving you guys a few more useful tips and some basic principles and some stuff that we hadn't seen before. I got some, pictures I've taken here and there that I think are somewhat interesting. At least they are to me, and I hope you sort of enjoy them too. This is not going to be a long presentation today like the one last time was. I hope that one helps you out. But right now, let's get into this. Whenever you see a rusty spark plug like this one, particularly if it comes out of a cylinder that misfires after you park, this is one of the ways that heads and head gaskets can fail that doesn't kill the vehicle. Sometimes whenever you park, when you switch it off and it goes through a hot soak and the pressure goes up in the system, it may push coolant into the cylinder just enough to foul the spark plug. And what will happen is you'll crank it, and when you first start it, it will skip just for about, 30 seconds, and then it'll clean up its act. And then the rest of the time you're driving, it doesn't give trouble, doesn't overheat, doesn't do anything like that, doesn't use any oil, doesn't get any water in the oil. But whenever you shut it off, like my Jeep did that, I would drive it all the way from where I worked, 30 miles from here, and I would park it at the grocery store, and I'd go in to get some bananas. And when I came back out, I'd fire it up, and it would be misfiring on cylinder number 3. That was because of a problem like this. Now, that plug right there is not out of my Jeep, but sometimes whenever you see one, and I've seen them rusty like this several times, it's just there is coolant making it into that cylinder, and particularly if there's only one plug that looks like that. Also, it won't always rust the plug, but you may see crusty greenish colored deposits if it's using green antifreeze and that kind of thing. So just keep that in mind. This was a plug that's the reason I took a picture of this plug. And I know it's a strange plug with 2 electrodes, but there's all kinds of funky looking plugs out there nowadays. But these here airbags, I'm going to talk a little bit about those. I've worked on these airbags for a long time. Ever since they first came out, they came out like in the late 80s, the airbags started showing up. They were talking about putting airbags on cars way back in the 70s. And the way that they were doing it back then is this plastic, big clear plastic stuff would come out from under the dash, which was a sort of a screwy idea that never really caught on. But they put the airbags on the steering wheel, right in the middle of it, under the horn button. See, to start with, when they first started putting airbags, they tried to put the horn buttons on the side. Some of you might even remember some of the Fords, like the Crown Victorias. You would have to push on the turn signal stalk to blow the horn, and everything that they did to try to move the horn away from where this airbag was. Of course, that pushing the turn signal stalk wasn't airbag related, but it was moving the horn to a place where people didn't like it. And so what they did was they put buttons on the spokes of the steering wheel while the airbag was there. Customers didn't like that. Customers wanted to be able to slam their hand on the middle of the steering wheel. Back in the olden days, there was this horn, there was a ring, half a ring on there where you could just get your thumb against it and all, but it was hooked to the thing in the middle of the wheel. Well, it's a sort of a dumb thing to me to put the airbag right in the middle of the steering wheel when you're going to be sliding into the back of somebody and you're going to lay on your horn, while putting your, the airbag's going to light off right into your hand. I don't know if anybody, I have never read about that causing anybody an injury, but I do know that steering wheel airbags can injure people. They're the most prone to injure folks. Now, you ladies that like to ride with your feet propped up on the dash need to not do that, because that passenger airbag, if it lights off, it will break you in half just about. So don't put your feet on the dash when the vehicle's going down the road. Of course, if you're just sitting there and somebody runs into you hard enough, runs into the front of the car hard enough, it'll light off too. So it's just best to keep your feet off the dash. And a lot of people like to sit that way, but those days should be gone now. But you notice these codes here. Now what we got right here is we got an airbag, see, loop number 1, see that? And there's that, basically, this is the same code, see, on demand and continuous memory. They're both, this thing is a hard fault, that's an on demand code, and a continuous memory code is one that's been stored. So that's the same thing. Okay, so we look at these airbag business, and this is basically just a sort of a generic wired up for this thing. You got a supplemental restraint control module typically that will be a separate box usually, And on some of them, it will be mounted so that it has a crash sensor in it. In these crash sensors, used to, they would have a gold-plated ball sitting against a magnet, and it would be sitting in a tube. And if it got hit hard enough, that gold-plated ball would break loose from that magnet and roll down that tube and touch a couple of gold-plated contacts. And the way that they had the airbags fixed up, the airbags wouldn't light off unless the ground trigger, in other words, you had two different crash sensors. One of them supplied ground, the other one supplied power. You put power and ground to an airbag, it's going to light off. That's why when you unplug the airbag, if you look down in there, there's a shorting bar that pops up there, and it actually shorts out against those two wires so that you won't have any static electricity in there. Now, you're not supposed to measure those airbags with, in other words, if you're measuring an airbag, like for example, if you got a code, let's say for this passenger airbag right here, you are not supposed to take a meter and measure the resistance of the heat of this heater in this airbag, which is basically, it's a firecracker is what it is. It lights off. If you do that, the little bit of current they claim that goes from this meter through that airbag could light it off. Now, I don't, whenever I had an airbag I was going to light off anyway that didn't matter, or, like on the Crown Victoria one time, there was one of these, they have these little seat belt tensioners that actually also, it's got a little firecracker in that, and it basically locks the inertial reel on your seat belt when you have a crash, so so it'll make sure that it keeps you from going forward. And of course, if you're, anyway, I could talk a lot about airbags and those things, but anyway, on a Crown Victoria I worked on that belonged to the college, the loop on that little seatbelt tensioner, basically it was a loop. It was real similar to one of these. Is only supposed to have a couple of ohms of resistance, and so since it was not dangerous, because the worst case scenario, if you measure it and it lights off that little firecracker down there in the seatbelt thing, it's not going to mess anything up because you're going to replace it anyway. And it had a code for that. Now, you could have wire connectors, not wire, mostly the wire connectors on these things are gold plated anyway, like a lot of other stuff now. But the wire, the circuit loop could have been cut or chewed by the rat or something like that. But whenever I took my meter and I measured it, I got nothing, right? And I was enough, since the college was paying for it, when I got the new one out, I measured that one too, and it didn't light off. Now, you can do that if you want to, but if you light one off, it's on you. So I'm telling you, you're not supposed to do that. Now, let's say that you wanted to troubleshoot a code like the one that we just saw back here. The other code on the previous slide, what would you do? You would take this, unplug this airbag, get it out of there, and then you would there's a little dummy load that they sell, or you could actually fabricate you one with a 2 ohm resistor. And so that 2 ohm resistor, basically, and it's got a little resistor in here, that 2 ohm resistor is basically going to fool this module into thinking there's an airbag there. Now, anytime you're working on these airbag systems, you're always supposed to replace, all of the airbags are supposed to be disconnected, and you're supposed to have a dummy load for each airbag. On this one here, that would be quite a few, basically. And so, if you think about it, so basically what you got here is 1, 2, 3, 4 on this system here. Most of them, there's a lot of, got curtain airbags, seat airbags, and all that kind of stuff too. But if you disconnect that and you put a 2 ohm resistor in between there, and you make sure you don't damage the connectors and all, you can put a 2 ohm resistor at every place, and then you can run your diagnostics, and you're not going to accidentally light off an airbag because the airbags are out of the loop. So let's say that you got a problem indicating that there was a problem with this one right here. You got a problem indicating there's one right here, and you've unplugged it, and you plug in your 2 ohm resistor into this connector right here, bypassing the airbag thing, and it throws you a code. It throws you no code, and you clear the code and it doesn't come back. So that way, you got a problem inside the airbag. So that's not too terribly complicated. Now, once again, I'm going to say this again, and I've said it before, don't ever modify the airbag system, don't ever modify the cruise control system, and don't ever modify the anti-lock brakes. Those are three things you should never modify. Any vehicle dynamic system that could cause a crash needs to be fixed back to standard operating specifications. I mean, the wire harness and everything. Even repairing a wire harness is really not a good idea if you want to keep yourself out of trouble. Because when you think about it, let's say you've modified your cruise control or whatever, your anti-lock brakes, and something doesn't work right and it causes a crash, and you're the one that worked on it, and yes, you worked on the anti-lock brakes, and you know, sir, our insurance investigators indicated that you had done this little patch, or you had made this little change, or you made a design change, you know, did you or did you not do this? You know, of course, you're supposed, if you're under oath, you're supposed to say, you know, tell the truth. It's best to say, I restored it to OEM specs. That's the best thing you can say. Now, this type of original equipment gasket used to be on a lot of Fords and Chevys, and I think some Dodges, and these things love to fail. This particular one was on a Chevy pickup that was just pouring water out here, and you might notice that this is a Felpro gasket right here, and you notice how much more substantial this is made and how less likely it is to fail. This was plastic, and it had this silicone here. You know, this was a plastic gasket, and so this thing right here, when you're running hot coolant through something like that, and it's got this, you know, crappy plastic and all that kind of stuff, you can see how that thing right there, you know, would just let all kinds of water out when it failed. And I've seen that. I've seen it on Fords and Chevys alike. I guess the gasket, somebody, whoever came up with that idea, figured those gaskets would last a lot better than they do. But typically, when over time it turns out something's not going to work like it's supposed to, and it's not going to protect the, you know, engine from having a massive water leak, they'll actually modify. You know, the gasket manufacturers like Felpro and these other reputable manufacturers will put together a gasket that's going to do a lot better job than the original gasket. And one of these, this is a Felpro gasket here. I put the picture on and everything. Thank you, Felpro, for making good gaskets. Although I did see a set of, you know, the little holes in the head gaskets on like a V6 or V8, where the water passages are there to slow the water down so it doesn't go so fast through the head. If it goes through there too fast, it'll burn the engine up because it's going through there so fast it's not collecting any heat from the head. And one time we were going to put some head gaskets on a Taurus 3-liter, and the student that was working on it was sharp enough to where he laid both the old gasket and the new gasket out on the table. And for some strange reason, and I don't know how this happened, those holes, and I should have a picture of this up on the screen for you to look at, but I fumbled the ball on that. But you can look at head gaskets and look at the water passage, and there'll be a really small hole that's nowhere near as big as the actual water passage that goes from the block into the head. Okay, this guy, when he laid them out on the table, he called me over there and he says, look at this. This one has these little holes here. This was the original gasket. The new one has got this full-size cutout that's the same size. And I got a hold of the parts man, he got a hold of Felpro, and they said, do not use those gaskets. Send those back, that's an error, it's a mistake, they never should have been built that way. And then they sent us another set of gaskets that were made the right way. But anyway, gaskets are a lot more complex, you know, than a lot of people think they are anyway. Now this right here, this was one I had a clogged EGR passage on. And it's basically, there's a passage in this one. It was, I think, if I'm not mistaken, this was on a Pontiac Aztec. And what we needed to do was clean out that passage, go into that EGR valve, and it's got a hole that goes through there kind of crooked and comes out. And it was completely clogged up with stuff. And you can't really get a straight shot in there no kind of way. And so, and I didn't want to have to, you know, pull it out and turn it upside down and all that nonsense. So what I did was I used an old park brake cable that we had on hand, cut it off, put this in the drill, you can see that right there, and basically went down, and I kind of whiskered these wires out, you know, kind of like that right there a little bit, and I went down in there driving that with that drill, and it managed to curve right in there and clean that thing out. And I followed up, you know, with carburetor cleaner and air, spraying air through there and all that kind of stuff, and we unclogged our EGR, got rid of the BO401. And so that's just a little, you know, thing you can do when you're cleaning out one of them holes like that that's hard to get into. All right, now then, Dexcool. A lot of people, I don't know, you know, what GM's thing is on this, but it's orange coolant that General Motors like to use. Ford uses it on some of their vehicles too. And it's this same kind of Dexcool stuff. And I'm not going to get into the way it, all of the, the HOT and the OAT and all that kind of stuff that people talk, the organic acid, what technology coolant or whatever, all of that stuff, all those, is basically the orange coolant just really does us a disservice, especially if you service it like you're supposed to. That's okay, but a lot of people will go a long time without servicing their coolant system. They feel like as long as it's not running hot, their coolant system don't need service. But if you follow the manufacturer specifications on when you're supposed to change your coolant, you're a whole lot better off. Because once all of this rusty crud winds up getting into the engine block and all, it ain't never the same again. That's just all there is to it. This particular picture that you see right here, that was on a, if I remember right, it was on a 06 Impala. And we kept having to flush this thing out, kept having to flush it out. We would flush it out and we'd get it looking pretty good. And then it would come back and it would have a bunch more of this crud showing up in here. Finally, we managed to replace the radiator and run a whole bunch of stuff, flush through the engine block and all that kind of stuff, put a thermostat in it and that kind of thing. So we finally got most of it out of there. But this is what it, some of them look like when you pull the radiator cap out. Obviously, this cap's going to need to be replaced. This cruddy mess is all over there. But that was, now the coolant that I like was the coolant that came in Fords in 2007, which was in my Taurus had this that I used to drive. I had an '07 Taurus and I had an '07, I've got an '07 F-150. They had this Motorcraft Gold coolant in it, and that stuff is really good as far as I've been able to tell. Because now I follow the coolant replacement interval specifications for that, and I love that gold coolant, so I put it back in there if that's what was in there to start with. There are coolants you can buy that are supposed to be compatible with just any other coolant, and there's there's pros and cons on that, and there's people that say no, you should never do that, and there's other people that say, hey, what the heck, who cares, and all that. But one way or another, having a look in the coolant system is a good thing. You can also go from the negative terminal on your battery, dip it into your radiator water, and see if you've got any electrolysis going on in there. If you read 3 or 4 volts in the coolant, you're going to have some ion transfer, and there's going to be some cavitation going on, probably in a water pump, other places like that. Now this is a Chrysler electrical school story. I went to, every time I've ever gone to an electrical school, when I would start working for her, we got a new franchise or whatever, we bought the Jeep franchise back in '89, I think it was, at the Ford dealership. And so I immediately had to go to electrical school with Jeep. So I went to electrical school with Jeep. And then Chrysler bought Jeep, and so I had to go to Chrysler electrical school. They don't care if you've been to electrical schools with Volkswagen and GM and Ford and everybody else. They want you to go to do your electrical school with them. So I went to this electrical school that was, in a place in Louisiana over there. I drove down there, and there was a guy who was training to be an instructor. And him and me and the regular Chrysler instructor was in that same room. And I said, and he says, these alternating lights, and this is what I'm talking about right here, that particular one, this one, and this one over here, basically, let me see, that one over there, I can't go back, but the thing about it is, whenever you turn on your headlights, the front light and the side marker light come on together, and then whenever you turn on the and there's a video on my YouTube channel about this, about these turn signals. You can look it up. But whenever you turn on your lights, they come on together. But when you turn on your turn signals, they alternate. But if your lights are off, they both flash at the same time. And the way they do that is, you can see how I had that wired up on that previous slide. The little light that doesn't have very much it's got a higher resistance, is actually wired to both of the big filament wires. It's wired to the tail light, and it doesn't go directly to ground. It always has to get a ground through one or the other of those filaments. And so that works really smooth for giving you those alternating lights without having to use a relay. Well, the guy at the Chrysler school, he didn't know how that worked, so which I thought was very interesting. The instructor didn't know how it worked, so I drew it on the board. I mean, I didn't do it with everybody watching, I did it with that one guy so he'd understand it. and all that. But I used to horse around at the Ford place doing all that kind of stuff. On my toolbox, I had a little power supply I had built and everything, and I was testing things and firing up ignition, you know, just whatever. If I didn't have something else going on, and there wasn't some fans to be blown out or mounted, there wasn't a computer software to be updated, and if there wasn't anything else to do, which I usually tried to do because of the way I got paid, I was always looking after stuff that a lot of people, you know, wouldn't touch because they didn't get flagged for it. But because of the way they were paying me, I just did all kinds of stuff other guys wouldn't do. But long and short of it was, I would sit down there at my toolbox and I would work on learning how things worked, because I'd wire this up and wire that up and check this out. And I was always, you know, thirsty for knowledge about that, and it stood me in good stead when I became an instructor later on. I didn't learn all the answers. Nobody has all the answers. Nobody knows everything about everything. But this one right here, you know, these Toyotas are probably some of the more dependable vehicles that I know about. Now, some of you other guys may have different opinions on this. I do know that Toyota's wiring is a devil of a lot more complicated than it needs to be. You know, you can basically look at it, the wiring on a Toyota and the wiring on another car, and it's basically, it seems to me like there's a lot more wires on a Toyota than there is on a lot of other vehicles. Anyway, this one here, I thought this was a really nice Toyota to be sitting beside the road. It looks like it's in line behind this other car, but this car is parked on the shoulder. I was on an access road looking up there at it, and it's got no license plate on it, and it's just kind of parked beside the road there. Now, I don't know why it's parked there, but it would seem very strange to me if a car was still running that somebody would park it beside the road and just abandon it this way, because there was nobody with this car, which I thought was very interesting here. And no vehicle is immune to a breakdown. I don't care what kind of, you know, a lot of times people will say, well, I'll never own another Dodge, or I'll never own another Volkswagen, or I'll never own another. You can say that all you want to, but any car can break down. I don't care what make it is, who made it, where it was made. It could be American, it could be Asian, it could be Korean, it could be made anywhere else. But every car is going to be subject to breakdown sooner or later. Now, some have better track records than others, but you know, you're basically going to have, if anything is made by man can break. And it doesn't matter if it's brand new, and it doesn't matter if it's got 100,000 miles on it or 200,000. You know, back in the 1960s, if you had a car with 100,000 miles on it, you were doing really good, because most cars didn't last that long back then. Nowadays, it's not unusual for a car to have 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 miles on it, because they worked out a lot of the bugs. But any car can break down for just about any reason. So anyway, just take that for what it's worth. Some cars just keep on going. This 81 Chevy here, and I think it's either a, you know, 79, 80, 81, something like that. It's hard to tell. They made these look almost exactly the same from like 1976. You know, there were some minor changes that were made through about 1991. The car had this basic body shape to it on these Chevy Impalas, but then they started. Or, you know, Caprice, you know what I'm talking about, these Chevy Caprices. But they wound up, this one here, and I see them around, you know, they still go. This is one of the most generic looking, boring cars I've ever seen. It looks like a rent-a-car, you know, but they're pretty darn good cars all the way around. And one of the reasons that they last so long there is because they worked the bugs out of them. They've been out there so long, they worked the bugs out of them. My dad bought a 77 model, that looked like this. It was a light green one, and it had a rounded off camshaft a little bit. It was doing that machine gun firing out the carburetor, pop, 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 when it would run. And so it had a 305 in it, and we put a camshaft from a 350 in it, and it ran good, but it just sucked gas like you wouldn't believe. But anyway, that was just another little funny thing that we did. And that car ran for a long time. It changed hands 2 or 3 times amongst, you know, my dad might give it to my sister. My sister sold it to the guy that was renting from my mother and all this kind of stuff. Now, this Chevy tailgate at the Chick-fil-A basically marked my Explorer with a bow tie. I'm looking at this super shiny tailgate. I'm looking at the reflection of my white Ford Explorer, and I hear it looks like it's got a Chevy bow tie in the middle of it. You know, how often do you see that? All right, so now this Ford 500 has been sitting in this same spot, this same way, for several months. I was noticing this thing sitting there, and for about 6 or 8 months it sat there fully intact. nobody had taken anything off of it or been working on it, as far as you could tell from the road. But then they started tearing it down. What they're doing here, I do not know, but you can actually look at the way that it's been took apart, and you can tell that they're just sort of, you know, I don't know if they got their kid working on it, tearing it down just to see if he can figure out how to pull it apart or whatever. How many times have you ever seen anybody when they were touting their skill as a mechanic saying, my nephew or my son-in-law or whoever can take a car apart and put it back together from one end to the other? I'm not impressed with that. What I'm impressed with is a guy that can listen to the car and do a little diagnosis, tighten a couple of screws, and maybe replace one part and fix it. That's the good mechanic. And somebody that rips it apart from one end to the other, I mean, there's really no point in that unless you're trying to show that you can do it. That's an awful lot of work for no reason. The least amount of work you can do to get that car fixed the right way, and so that it won't come back and the customer will be happy, you know, that's what you need to be working on. But this thing right here, I'm going to keep my eye on this car here. It's a Ford 500, like an 05 model. It'll be sitting there for a while. Whenever one gets to this stage, it has been sitting there for 2 or 3 months with the hood up in the rain and everything, I would venture to say that you could probably, and I'm not a betting man, but you could lay some pretty good money that this car will never run again. And, you know, of course, there's a lot of cars sitting around that'll never run again that have never had anything took off of them. This one here is a train wreck. All right, now electric power steering motors are 3-phase brushless DC motors. Why do they use brushless DC motors on power steering? Well, one of the reasons is you can actually apply a lot of torque on a brushless DC motor that you cannot apply on a motor with brushes. In other words, they need to be able to go back and forth with a tremendous amount of torque. You got to have a lot of torque to operate that steering. And you know, this right here is on a Ford. I don't remember what Ford it was, but I was over there talking to my buddy Jimmy at the Ford place, and he had pulled the engine out. And he had this cradle lid on the floor, and it had that electric power steering unit there. But long and short of it is that they actually have a bunch of different ways of making this. I think I did I know I did a presentation on electric power steering a while back, and I also wrote a course. If you've been any courses from Cars on Demand in Canada, and you can go up there and get you some training, good stuff, but you got to pay for it. You know, it's not free. I wrote a course on electric power steering for Cars on Demand. Now, I don't use any of their stuff in my PowerPoint presentations because they paid me to do that, and so I'm not going to pirate the stuff that I wrote for them on my own channel. But I did learn a lot about electric power steering that I never would have known when I wrote that electric power steering course for Cars on Demand. Now, you can take that course and you won't see my name on it anywhere. I don't think they put my name on it anywhere. You know, but that's their property anyway now because they paid me to write it for them. Anyway, that's electric power steering has always been interesting to me. Now, I don't know if you've ever noticed the difference in the way a brushless DC motor and a DC motor with brushes works. But let's have a look at this. Basically, what you got here is on the one on this side, this brushless motor. You notice the magnets are on the part that spins. They're on the what we would call an armature. But on the brushed DC motor, and these are your brushes right here, on the brushed DC motor, the magnets are on the outside. So the magnets are on the inside, and basically you have to have some electronics on one of these brushless motors for the so that you can see this. It's creating this field to drive that motor around, and that's the kind of motor. It's a 3-phase, and this when I say 3-phase, 1, 2, 3 phases. You notice, and whenever it's shooting juice in there, the ground is around the outside there. Shooting juice in there, it walks it around. It's vaguely similar to a stepper motor. You know, that you used to see for your idle air control and various different things. But this is the kind of motor that they use on electric power steering, this is a neat little animation. I found some of these and pulled them together for this. So just keep that in mind. Me and the boys one time found a little kit that you could buy at Radio Shack where you could wind this thing make a little commutator, stick a couple of magnets on there, and then whenever you applied power to it, that little armature you built would whirl, and it was very instructional when it came to electric motors, and it taught the boys a whole lot. One time my son Matt, whenever the boys were real little, I played with electrical stuff with them all the time, and I had this vehicle speed sensor that came off a Ford, and it had a little LED that we got from Radio Shack. Well, you know, the vehicle speed sensor makes alternating sine wave, and it doesn't put out a lot of current. And so I connected the LED to the to the vehicle speed sensor, and when I spun it with your finger, that little LED would light up. And Matt says, okay, let's see. And I had a bunch of little electrical components over here. He said, why don't we figure out a way to connect this electric motor to this vehicle speed sensor with that LED, and then we can hook a battery to the motor to run the motor, and it'll spin the speed sensor, and the little light will stay on all the time. And I said, well, that's okay, but it's a bunch of unnecessary hardware. If your objective is to get the light to stay on, why don't you just hook the battery to the LED instead of having that motor and that sensor in between? It was kind of funny. You know, he overthinking it's basically what he was doing. Now, anybody that messes up a fuel line like this, this is on a GM, you know, one of them CSFI, you know how aggravating some of those fuel lines can be. These fuel lines, if this pipe is not perfectly straight or you know, lined up perfectly with the fitting it's supposed to screw into, and they just try to crank it in there with a wrench, the threads will get badly screwed up, just like you see right here. And look at this, the way this thing is made. This is not just something you can just throw another flare nut on it. I mean, you're going to have that whole line. Now, you might be able to take a line that you got off something else, or find a repair kit somebody sells or something like that, and you know, and maybe on this right here, because of the fact that it's only carrying fuel with not very much pressure, maybe 60 pounds, you know, maybe 70 tops, you could use a copper tubing union on this. It ain't like working on a brake line where you're not supposed to use copper tubing union because they got 2,000 or 3,000 pounds of pressure on them when you do a panic stop. But whenever I had a student that did something like this, you know, I would really, really have a serious talk with them. I say, look how much time and money you've cost. If you've messed up the thing you're screwing it into, then that's going to have to be replaced too. And this right here never should have happened. You know, it was incompetence and being in a hurry. Anytime you get in a hurry, wanting to try to get something done, just to scramble along, try to get through with it because you're just wanting to be done with the job. Somebody else needs to be doing the work. And that's what happened here. This one here got really seriously messed up by the guy that was just figured he'd try to force it in there. But as it was, he just made a mess out of it, and we had to replace his fuel line. And some of these fuel lines go a long way. You know, it's not as simple as you'd think to replace that fuel line. And it can be pretty darn expensive unless you've got a source that sells it to you pretty cheap. You know, if you call the GM dealer and say, hey, I need a fuel line that goes from, you know, they'll say, oh, yeah, that's going to be $58, you know, or whatever like that, or maybe more than that. This is a detonation meltdown situation. Detonation is whenever the, you've got if anything causes the mix to light off before the spark plug, like for example, if you've got a lot of carbon on the head and on the piston that has raised the compression, or if you've got an engine that's running slightly too hot, whenever that mix is drawn in there, before the spark plug fires, if it lights off while that piston is still coming up, of course you're going to have it before top dead center anyway, but if it lights off too far before top dead center because of excessive heat, too much compression, or whatever, then you're going to have some issues. Now, they used to claim, I had heard some of the instructors claim that if you disable the EGR valve on some of these vehicles back in the 80s, it would burn a hole in the piston. I don't ever know that I've ever seen that. I mean, they might have, because EGR valve does lower combustion chamber temperature so you don't form oxides of nitrogen. But the simple fact is, I've never seen anything like this happen. Now, just because I've never seen it doesn't mean it's never happened. I had a 22-year-old, 21-year-old guy that was in my automotive department one time, and he was telling me that every time I would, be talking about a way to troubleshoot something, he said, well, I've never seen that. And I was thinking, yeah, you're 20 years old and you've seen everything, right? But the long and the short of it is, if you hear pinging and detonation and it's excessively bad, you could wind up seeing something like this. This is an extreme case. Now this, there was a Cherokee, Grand Cherokee, and it had a harsh downshift, and it didn't want to down, and then when it did downshift, it would slam. And we found out, the minimum TPS reading that we got on that one, and this is a shot of that screen. I was looking for the shot I had of the screen where whenever we let off and it was doing that, it was reading 1.35 volts in this area. Well, not on the minimum TPS. Minimum TPS 0.84. It was looking for the TPS to return to this value that it had stored at startup, and whenever it was not returning, it thought you were still had your foot in it, and whenever you're slowing down and it was conflicting signals, and it would boom, it would slam the transmission. It seemed like a transmission problem, but when we started watching the TPS, we wound up that this 1.35 volts was an issue, and that TP sensor needed to be replaced. Well, the problem with that was we started to take those screws out, and this one here wouldn't budge. I mean, it wouldn't budge at all. So we basically ground the head off the screw. Of course, it had already rounded out. Ground the head off the screw, and I got a pair of vice grips gripping this little bitty screw, and it was just rounding it off like you see right here. I used a torch to try to melt the Loctite they had in there. That didn't work. Finally, believe it or not, and it just seems counterintuitive, I got a heat gun, which it doesn't seem like a heat gun would work as good as a torch, a little pencil torch. That heat gun, whenever I used the heat gun and I heated up that whole throttle body with that heat gun, this thing broke loose and came out of there. Of course, you can see the scorching I did on it trying to heat it up with that little torch. But anyway, that heat gun did a better job than a torch, which, like I said, I never would have believed that if somebody had told me that, but I experienced it on this one here. Anyway, we put the TP sensor on this one, and it would always return back to its minimum TPS reading, and then the harsh downshift was fixed. There was another one, it was an Oldsmobile that came in. It was a Oldsmobile 88, I think, in other words, not an 88, but an 88. And it was an 88 model, but not a year model, one way or another. And this guy thought that his wife had messed up the transmission and all that because of something she had put it in park while I was moving or something. I don't know what the deal was on that. But it turned out on that one that the transmission was doing crappy, crazy stuff because of a bad mass airflow sensor. So sometimes a sensor issue can cause the transmission to feel crazy. The misfiring spark plug will make people think they've got a transmission problem, and so on and so forth. But anyway, that was a little adventure we had on about a 2002 or 3 model Grand Cherokee. Now this right here is a cool little deal. Now you can't get this radio anymore, but there's a lot of other ones that are similar to it. This radio is one that I bought for a couple $100 off Amazon. It's got GPS. It's obviously got radio. It's got steering wheel controls if you want to program those in. It's got USB, SD. The SD up here. The maps are stored here with the GPS. Music is, so on and so forth. It's got a camera that you can mount on there. I never did put the camera on there. This thing doesn't boot up all that quick. So even if I did put the camera on here, by the time it got booted up, I've already backed out. So what in the world's the camera good for anyway? I could put a, camera going down the road looking at it or whatever. But I've got this ELM 327. It's made by Launch basically, but it was the only one that would interface with this torque app on this radio. The torque app came on the radio. And basically, I can have me a scan tool driving down the road. It'll give me my catalyst temperatures. It'll show me these live graphs. It works real nice to have that thing. It's really impressive to somebody whenever you've got this stuff going on while you're driving down the road. Of course, my dad always would tell me that's the kind of thing you look at while you're having an accident, because it takes your eyes off the road. But anyway, I just thought I would mention that. I've got this on my Explorer. And with GPS, I used the GPS when I went to Sarasota a few weeks ago, and it worked real good, and I didn't have any problem. It'll even tell you where the red lights are. It'll tell you when the red light coming up and all that. And it's pretty darn handy for that. But anyway, this little ELM 327, if you look that up, you can buy this particular one for $10 on Amazon, and then you can download the Torque app for your phone. And you can get a screen like this on your phone. Well, while you're doing that, and it'll pull codes and do all kinds of cool stuff. I just wanted to give that little thing a shout out. Now this right here was my 69 LTD that I bought for $950 when I was in high school. Before that, I had driven a 65, the 65 with the stacked headlights. Now you got to remember, this car, whenever I bought it for $950, was only 4 years old. Okay, so 4, maybe 5 years old. How much would a 5-year-old car cost you now? And what I liked about this was this was made like a cockpit. The dash, everything was here. The radio was right here. Now this one just had an AM radio, and because that's, you know, a lot of FM wasn't really a thing back then very much. It was coming on. But I bought an FM converter. I mounted it down here underneath this, and it basically plays through your AM radio. And you got perfect, beautiful FM sound. So you didn't have to hook up a lot of speakers or anything. You just basically connected this to power, and then you hooked up the antenna wire to the back of your radio, and it plays through the AM radio, but the AM radio's got to be on a particular frequency. But the long and the short of it is, this is pretty darn nice. And what I liked about it, with these troublemaking yo-yos that used to ride with me that didn't like to listen to the same kind of music I did, were always, you know, if you're riding where the radio's in the middle of the dash where they could reach it, they were always jacking around with the radio trying to find their music. They couldn't get to my radio because it was way over here on this side, on the left side over here. And so I just really appreciated the fact that everything was real personalized, and right over there and all that. So now this one right here, this is a 88 CRX. The guy crashed, and he really likes this little old car, and there was nothing wrong with the engine, but he had destroyed the body. He rolled it, that's what he did. Okay, so I told him, he said, hey, can y'all swap the engine in my CRX? You know, of course, I enjoy doing live work in my automotive program. A lot of automotive programs don't do live work, and that's their business. I'm not going to say everybody ought to do live work, but my students learn more doing live work than they ever did working on trainer cars. And so I had these guys put this motor in here. When they take it seriously, too, you'll be surprised how careful they are not to leave things loose. So what we wound up with, he brings us a car that looks like this one. And this is the same color, and just like the car he brought us. It was a beautiful little car. This is not the car, but it looked just like this. It was the same color and everything. It could have been this car's clone. Of course, this one here's got some license number on the front or whatever. But I found this picture online. All right, so here we had a good car with a bad engine and a crash car with a good engine. But look, this has got the 1.5 PGM FI with throttle body injection on it, and this has got port fuel injection. And so I asked my students whenever we first got this, I says, how are we going to handle this? And they said, well, I don't know, I guess we're going to pull all the wire harnesses and the engine controller and all that out of the yellow car and put in the blue one. And I said, no, we're not going to do that. We got a better way of handling this. I says, we're going to pull both engines out and get them sitting on the floor. Right? Okay. And then we're going to take the, well, actually, before we pulled the engine out, if you get right down to it, we didn't pull them out before we did it. We laid the manifold, intake manifold back, and we laid the exhaust manifold forward, and we brought the motor out of there. And whenever we got the motor brought out of there, we went ahead and bolted it all back up, put the good engine in the bad car. I'm sorry, the good engine in the good car. And then what we did, there's a short block, by the way. We had made ourselves a short block. This is the long block, got the head on it. This is the short block without the head. You can see this open cylinders there. So you have short block, long block, and there's the side view of the long block. Then you got a complete engine that's got all of the stuff on it, you know, manifolds and everything. But what we wound up doing was we fixed that doggone thing, and that guy wound up with a really nice ride for about $400. Of course, you know, back we don't charge any labor, and the time the smoke cleared and we got everything done, he drove out of there happy as a lark. Now he drove out of there with a 1.6 that had throttle body injection on it instead of having a 1.6 with a multi-point, but he couldn't care less about that. He just wanted the fuel economy. Anyway, that's all I had for you. This went a little longer than I thought it would, but I really appreciate you guys watching. I don't know how many of you made it to the end, but if you made it to the end, I really appreciate you watching, and I'll see you guys next week.